more on other issues than the South China Sea, particularly learning to understand more about every single Southeast Asian countries. Today, I'm not alone in the panel. I'm speaking with my beloved friend, right? I'm happy to say individual of my beloved friend. The first panelist is Muhammad Fazril Muhsaleh, Secretary General Angkatan Belia Islam Malaysia. Abang Fazril, apa kabar? Happy that you are joining us. And to give you another anecdote, me and Abang Fazril shared the same cabin uh, in a train to Kiev during war of Ukraine and Russia. So we shared a cabin together. So we exchanged many, right, from Malaysia, Indonesia, bilateral relationship up to down to cultural stories, etc. So Abang Fazil is a very dear friend of me. Thank you so much, Abang, for joining us.
Thank you,
The
Calvin.
second is Thomas Daniel, Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies Program in ISIS Malaysia. So, Thomas, thank you for joining me. And Thomas, also my very dear friend. We are often debate who's cooking Indomie better, Indonesia or Malaysia. But this is a true friendship that we have been cherished for a long time. The last speaker is Alicia Shafika, Asian representative to the International Steering Group of United Network of Young Peace Builders. And Elisa, I knew her when she was in My Diplomacy, a energetic youth group on foreign policy, and I just got received message from Dr. Kuying Hui from University of Kebangsaan Malaya that say she's the best student in her batch. So, welcoming three of you in the panel. We're going to be discuss about Malaysia in the two angles, foreign policy and the state of development. I'll kick the first questions to you, right? To all of you, what is Malaysian worldview? So why I'm asking this? Because I ask this questions which we expect as a public, which we do not know about Malaysian worldview, and we just take it for granted. Malaysian the foreign policy. We saw Anwar, Prime Minister Anwar, so active, going to BRICS, etc., etc., and even speak constructively on Cambodia and Thailand, and even host them with a good and with a good arrangement where the China and the U.S. Sit behind Prime Minister Anwar, and then like a bridging between Cambodia and Thailand, becoming a peace builder, and then Prime Minister Anwar also talking about the world order, the next world order, a lot of stuff coming out from Malaysia, particularly on the foreign policy. But what is really down to the grassroots about Malaysian worldview? I'm as Indonesian, I have a very limited, we have a very limited knowledge about Malaysian worldview, right? And although we are serumpun, right, we speak the similar language, but we do not much know each other, particularly on the foreign policy. And we want to know more. So I will give it back the microphone. I think my first microphone, I give it to Thomas, and then I'll go to Abang Fazri, and then to Elisa. Please enlighten us about Malaysian worldview, right? And you can comment about the foreign policy directions of Malaysia ahead. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kelvin. I think my background is from a foreign policy think tank, government linked. So perhaps the context of my answer will be very much linked to it takes on a more policy-centric sphere. I think if you ask me to describe Malaysian foreign policy, I will try to contextualize it based on two things. The first is that Malaysia is a big believer in multilateralism. Multilateralism has benefited this country tremendously ASEAN is a multilateral organization that Malaysia was a founding member of. Malaysia was also a founding member of the WTO. Malaysia is a big believer in sort of an inclusive, cooperative way of engaging things. You see these in various multilateral mechanisms and organizations that Malaysia is a part of. And perhaps this is why you see Malaysian foreign policy personalities, whether from academia, think tank, or perhaps even the government, politicians, etc., speaking out quite strongly in defense of multilateralism, in defense of inclusivity, in defense of established rules and norms, international rules, international norms of the way of doing things, especially when the system is globally is under pressure, and you've got new narratives about changing rules and changing norms. I mean, this is not to say that this is not to say that the current system or the previous system was perfect. It was, of course, very imperfect, but it was a system that largely worked for countries like Malaysia to benefit tremendously from it. The second element, really, when it comes to describing Malaysian foreign policy, I mean, yeah, some people will say neutrality, non-alignment, all these things, but to me, those are really semantics. We are neutral and non-alignment when we need to be, and when we're not, we're not. I think for me, what really comes out if you want to understand Malaysian foreign policy is that Malaysian foreign policy is deeply, deeply tied to trade. Uh, you know, you see, for Malaysia, trade on average works out for about anywhere between 120 to 100 to 38% of our GDP on average over the last 10 years. I think 2 years ago, it was 137 point something percent of the GDP. That's remarkably high, right? So this means that Malaysia is fundamentally dependent on international trade. We do not have, unlike Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, there is no substantial domestic market, consumer market to rely on. So there's a very limited market. And what this means is Malaysia trades with countries around it. Malaysia trades with the global supply chain. And you see that reflected in the percentage of GDP. Our wealth and development that we enjoy in Malaysia as a whole is because we trade and we occupy key positions on various global supply chains. So it has always been government policy to prioritize this. And that sort of explains Malaysia's broader bilateral relations with China, with the United States, where they've been segmentized where necessary, especially in light of disputes in the South China Sea or recent tariff negotiations with the US. You see it in the domestic political capital that leaders have been willing to sacrifice to ensure that Malaysia has first mover advantage in key regional arrangements. So I think to sum it up, our trade, our economy, the national development imperatives, these are fundamentally influential in our foreign relations and our national interests and views of the world.
Thank you, Thomas. I want to circle back to you about the international trade regimes, and I think that's a catch great interest of Malaysian foreign policy communities. Now to Abang Fazril. Bang Fazril, from the grassroots perspective, Bang, you're involved in many CSOs in Malaysia. You understand the mood of the Malaysian people. How is Malaysian view worldview? Because in Indonesia, the reasons why foreign policy community of Indonesia was established back then, because many people have a xenophobic, to the foreigners, and we try to tell them that the international is the seas of opportunities. Does that also happen in Malaysia about the looking to the international seas? Because as far we know, Malaysia always right in the crossroad, always exposed to international communities, and have been enjoying much, like Thomas said, benefited much with the international communities. Please, Abang Fazril, enlighten us on this.
My brother Calvin, Thomas, Daniel, and also Elisa. Very good afternoon. Assalamualaikum. Salam sejahtera. Selamat siang. First of all, I just want to highlight that whatever we do as a nation, we need to consider the very roots of the people, because nation itself will not stand without people. So economy what is the meaning of economy if there is no people? So economy is not about numbers per se. It is about how do we give back to the people? How do we develop our nation to become something meaningful to achieve happiness? So, so that is the meaning of life actually. So when we talk about what are the worldview of Malaysia, it's a very philosophical question, Calvin. Afternoon of Friday, Friday evening, and you are talking about philosophy. So thank you. What is the Malaysian world Chong? So to me, as as a Malaysian people, I'm optimistic. For me, Malaysia, as well as the people in Southeast Asia, actually we share the same roots. So from the very beginning, since the antiquity, our ancestors has put some of the tradition, very good tradition, never cut off your tradition, your cultures, if it is good. So for me, number one, the worldview. Maybe it is more correct if I say it is a kind of ethos. No? Number one, for me, human dignity, respect others, so that Southeast Asia is actually a melting pot for many cultures. It is not today, it is not a decade before, it is hundred and maybe thousand years ago. So we can share the same land, tanah air bersama with others, and we share the culture, we share the civilization. So that number one, human dignity. So we respect human being, we respect others. That's number one. Number two, the principle of brotherhood. Because of that, we can become one nation. Yes, in Malaysia we have the composition of ethnicities, Malay, Chinese, India, the Sarawakian, Sabahans, etc. So you can see that all in all, we still one nation, the Bangsa Malaysia. So I believe in brotherhood. If you want to go fast, yeah, please run by yourself. But if you want to go far, yes, we can go far by going together. So that's number two. Number three, the principle of good deeds. So human dignity, respect each other, will outcome, no, the principle of brotherhood. And when we have brotherhood, so we must uh, helping each other with good deeds. So this is some of the optimistic worldview that we need to dig, upon our tradition. That is why the question is very
Okay, Abang Fazril, I think we lost you, so we return to
great.
you later on.
uh, Chairs of
But now I move to
ASEAN
Elisa.
and then
Elisa, tell me
becoming
about the youth. Bang Fazril, I think we just lost you. Can you hear me now?
hello, okay, you hear me?
Yeah, now okay. So please continue. Right. Okay.
Okay,
Right.
okay, yes, yes. Now I actually position of Malaysia is very strategic. We are the chairs of ASEAN, and then becoming member of BRICS. And now as a nation, we are trying to navigate uh, the recent condition that people are talking for decades, a multipolar world, and now it has been maybe clearly to be realized. And on this kind of multipolarity, equitable multipolarity, uh, a kind of belief system, so a belief in the rule-based system, inclusive order, where ASEAN and our principle of ASEAN centrality is being preserved and strengthened. So also we can becoming kind of a bridge that um, trying to connect together between the multipolar world that has been divided. I give you an example of our tradition, a story of Sang Kancil. I think in Malaysia, in Indonesia, Brunei, Singapore, we all know the story of Sang Kancil. Actually, the story of Sang Kancil signifies uh, the condition of our people. We are Sang Kancil. We are pelanduk. Kata orang Indonesia pelanduk. Kan? Kata orang Sabah Sarawak pelanduk juga. Jadi, we are the pelanduk. We are the Sang Kancil. We are living in between of the huge powers. And we are living in the islands, navigating the seas. Whenever enemies come, there is no place to run. You have to face them. So that's why Sang Kancil come in, you know, in our story of our nation, story of our tradition, story of our culture. So that is why when now in the modern day, the US-China rivalry, and then comes to choose a very pragmatic engagement. Even we are clever than India. Sorry to say, India they are playing two pawn, but Malaysia win better in terms of doing this kind of communication as well as engagement with the US in terms of tariff. So when we are talking about foreign policy, it is not made only in government halls. So like what I have been stated just now, it should come to the very nature of human being, to the people, benefit the people. So moving forward, I think our task as a people, as a citizen of Malaysia, and as an ASEAN community, our task is to sustain the principle of practicality and pragmatism, like Sang Kancil, but in good terms and a good way. Ambitious yet realistic, cooperative yet sovereign, visionary yet grounded in the need of our people. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Bang Fazril. I want to circle back to about ASEAN later on after this. Eliza, please tell me from your perspective, the youth, right? How will you foresee Malaysian foreign policy ahead and about the world, please?
All right. Thank you so much, first and foremost, for PSAT to basically invite me to give a bit of thoughts. But unfortunately, most of my thoughts actually was taken by Thomas and Fazril. I was actually thinking of trying to tell you about the story of Kanchil as well. But maybe perhaps what I can do is I provide a bit of extension that I think could supplement a couple of the points raised. First, I think as mentioned by Fazril, very well eloquently mentioned about how a lot of our foreign policy historically has been seeing like us trying to maneuver a lot of these powers, trying to be, I don't want to put sly, because often than not we say sly, it always come out as a negative connotation, but it's about how to be strategic and pragmatic in seeing a lot of the angles. And I think it actually resonates a lot even up to the point of youth and contemporary means. Because first point I want to raise is that when we look at a lot of quote unquote policy issues, I don't want to mention only foreign policy, because a lot of the issues that we debate, even let's say climate change and etc., it can be intertwined with foreign policy. So when we look at these issues, it tends to be separated. One, we have I would say state engineered. So most of the issues would be like national security, boundaries, those I would say very security-esque or even trade issues. But other than that, I would say, things that are much more less sexy on the newspapers. For instance, like maybe these days climate change are much more happening, but issues of culture, migrant issues, education, and etc., it tends to be more people engineered. So I think one angle that I want to say is that this cultural analogy allows us to kind of expand the boundaries of maybe should we explore the ideas of not having, say, the elitists trying to procreate, like I would say, or engineer the foreign policy direction. Or even with the foreign policy direction moving ahead, how do you then manifest that? So I think more actors are now coming into play, and it's not only towards like senior officials. So if, for instance, now, if you take a look in the current ASEAN chairmanship, I think we'll debate this much more after this, but generally, a lot of the summits are now, I think it's much more, there's a word, we call it merakyatkan here in Malaysia. So basically, we're trying to localize or democratize. Often than not, we don't see a lot of it being hosted by, let's say, government entities, be it the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or even the respective ministries in charge of that topic. So we're now seeing that it's a joint effort between, let's say, youth entities with other bigger NGOs, or even in collaboration with other multilateral agencies like UN and etc. So I think it offers a quite dynamic change when we look into like worldviews. But putting aside, let's say, these topical issues or even foreign policy, I think allow me to be a bit more critical, and maybe expand beyond what we think is happening, let's say, in Putrajaya or even in KL. A lot of the issues that Malaysians are thinking, or even youth, sadly, I don't think the, how to say, the connection between world issues and domestic issues are linked up properly. So often than not, a lot of the, I'll say, focus that we have at hand is still bread and butter issues. But obviously, it will be linked later on, like let's say, impacts of tariffs on how is it going to happen inside current modern day, or even like I'll say day-to-day groceries and etc. But I think if the issues that are much more prominent at the international stage is affecting your bread and butter, that is when Malaysians tend to speak up. Because if not, the issues tends to be very distant. And I think Malaysians are, I would say they are in the knowns of the issue, but they won't really be vocalized enough to speak about it. So there might be efforts of having forums and couple of discussions, but it tends to happen more in like a democratic or like in an academic space, rather than actually having like a very full nationwide movement or mobilization. So that, I think, going back to the main original question, how Malaysian tried to view these points is really contingent upon how do we angle it out and how much importance does it actually relay back to our life. So I'll stop there and then we can see how we can go with the conversation as well.
Thank you, Alisa. Thank you for bringing up the merakyatkan, right? Grassrooting. I think that's an important keyword. I want to circle back to Thomas and then Fazil and also Alisa with a different set of questions to you, right? To Thomas, uh, thank you for recommitting that Malaysia has been and always been with multilateralism and even echoed by Fazil, multipolar world, right? Um, but the international trade regimes is collapsing, right? The WTO is not that effective anymore. Even WTO is the most effective, most complex mechanism in dispute settlements, in a multilateral setting, but now is being paralyzed, with a lot of disruptive tariffs, particularly with the Trump tariffs. Um, and then how Malaysia can survive with such a context, right? And how are you envisioning more robust a safety net in the region, like we have RCEP already, we have you are in CPTPP, right? With this bowl of noodle bowls of regional network trade in the region. Are you looking for that directions, or you're trying to fix the WTO? How Malaysia trying to navigate this kind of circumstances? That for Thomas, and then to Fazril quickly. Um, you talk about inclusivity. I think that's an important mantra in Southeast Asia about the inclusivity, but inclusivity, human dignity, right? But the problem is, right? We are now seeing even human dignity in other part of the world is not being addressed, right? The dignified human is not really issues like in Palestine, even in Ukraine, we saw ourselves there. The dignity of human is somehow being subdued with the geostrategic ambition, right? How what do you think from Malaysia point of view to and Southeast Asia, right? Right with the hotspot, right? Now we have Cambodia and Thailand, right? Even we have differences between Indonesia and Malaysia. How do you suggest a way forward that we keep these principles relevant and avoid conflicts in Southeast Asia? And for Elisa, you talk about grassrooting, right? And however, my question is to you, right? Um, how far, okay, with the ASEAN context, right? The civic space in foreign policy making in Malaysia. Let's start in Malaysia. How far the civic space for foreign policy making being played out in Kuala Lumpur or in Putrajaya or in Malaysia context, and I want to know. So I'll start with Thomas about the trade. Thomas, how you navigate this complexities, and I'll go to Elisa and then to Abang Fazril at the end. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Sure. I should start off with the caveat that I'm not a trade expert. I'm certainly not an expert on economics or trade. So that said, I think these trade pressures, the upheavals in the global trade system, the ripple effects, direct or ripple effects to Malaysia, these are, I think, really, I don't want to say existential because it's not, but it's very severe. The impact is very severe because a lot of people I know I sound like a broken record, but a lot of people underestimate just how important international trade is to the Malaysian economy. I think that you see a couple of reactions from officials so far. I think you do see a mix of forward thinking, a bit of creative thinking, but you also see pragmatism. Let me try to address what I think that is. In terms of pragmatism, you see Malaysia being very pragmatic when it comes to negotiating with its biggest trade partners, whether it's the United States or China. You do see, you see all these calls for Malaysia to take a stand against the United States, etc. But the numbers show a completely different picture, right? The numbers show that this country is fundamentally dependent on exports to the United States. US is not our biggest trade partner, but the US is one of our biggest markets. Outside of Southeast Asia. We export our manufactured products to the United States, not to China. The US is our biggest source of foreign investment over many years. The type of investment that comes in is very specific. It's the kind of high-end investment that Malaysia is looking for. So to try to, there is a desire to sort of navigate this, and that's why you see the government going ahead and trying to cut a trade deal. Although how sustainable this trade deal is, I do not know. You also see pragmatism when it comes to engagement with Beijing, where you ensure that the relationship is segmentized so that the issues or the challenges don't interfere with what works fundamentally well, which is trade and investment, etc. I think on the forward-looking side, I think you have seen, particularly this year, but you saw elements of it from last year, this narrative of Malaysia understanding that the trade order as it is changing. Now, what it's changing to, no one knows for sure yet. But what it would require is it would require greater flexibility and greater the ability to align on the Malaysian side. So does this mean continued dependence on the US and China? No, it means that we're going to start looking at other markets. We're going to start looking at other regional groupings. I think that is fundamentally behind the move to BRICS. It is not part of a geopolitical realignment. I don't completely agree with that point of view. I think it's very much about Malaysia looking for options, right? Not options against anyone, but options for ourselves. Because you see this in the trade mechanisms that Malaysia is a part of. We were a part of the TPP, and when the TPP was scrapped and became the CPTPP, we continued. We joined IPEF when it came out, RCEP, etc. Although RCEP doesn't seem to have much traction about it at the moment. I hear an RCEP meeting will be taking place later this year in KL, sort of almost at a leaders level meeting. So let's see whether that happens. So you see this desire, right, to again try to re-engage with groupings like the GCC, to engage with newer players in Europe, in Eastern Europe in particular, to see what you can do with Mercosur, to look at emerging markets like Bangladesh, for example, and to see what options do we have there. But fundamentally, I think at a more pragmatic level, you'll also see, I suspect, Malaysia taking steps to ensure that it remains relevant to its major trading partners, right? The United States, China, the EU, other ASEAN member states, etc. So aside from just cutting trade deals with them, we need to make sure that Malaysia remains an attractive proposition for them, because no one is going to engage with Malaysia for charities purposes. We need to show good value, and I think that's what we're going to see. My last point, and I'm sorry, I'm going on for quite a bit, but the last point is that I think, you see all these narratives about, ASEAN needing to increase trade among each other, do more trade. That's great. And I think that's really the direction to go. But I suspect that's easier than done. ASEAN likes to trade more with ASEAN member states prefer to trade more with outsiders than they do with each other. There are some exceptions to the rule, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. But it's quite an exception, because we have a lot of non-tariff barriers against each other as well. So this whether we're all ready to actually move in the direction of doing more trade and more services with each other is a question of political will, and whether the vested interests can be catered to, or in some cases put down.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a very comprehensive answer to my questions. But a little bit, circling back a little bit on ASEAN, right? Do you think that Anwar has a ambition personally and country that Malaysia should do more and lead more in ASEAN in any case of geopolitical strategic issues? I just want to know what's your view.
Malaysia is chair, so there's always an expectation for Malaysia to do more this year. But honestly, I think what will only be effective if we can do stuff with other ASEAN member states. If you can't bring other ASEAN member states along, then you're not going to be effective at all, no matter which state it is. I think even Indonesia has now realized that it's impossible to push things on its own without ASEAN member states. Even though Indonesia has that heft as the largest ASEAN member, that there are limitations to it.
All right, that's a very short and sharp answer. Thanks so much. Elisa, about the grassrooting, about the civic space in Malaysia's foreign policy making, and please tell us more.
All right. I think this question is very interesting because there's an element of looking how I'll say influential the grassroots are happening at the national level, and if I may, to also compare it at the regional level. But I could say the answers are relatively almost the same, where you can definitely see Malaysia. One thing I'm very proud is that the civic space is getting much more rampant, it's getting more vibrant in a sense where I think there has been a record that there's a number of newer registrations with the ROS, which is the Registrar of Society when it comes to societies and clubs, and even NGOs have to be registered to kind of operate a lot. But I think while this manifested in a good way, it also means that there are also challenges, I would say. before I get into that, I would say essentially with this rampant of vibrancy of civic space, um, there will also be a tendency that you see more, I think, influence going into policy making. Um, but I think the challenge is now first is that a lot of this vibrancy tends to be in certain bubbles, if I may. So you actually will see more like quote unquote crowd favorites topics. For instance, in Malaysia right now we have a rampant issue on bullying. So that is quite recently like a bill is being passed through in Parliament. And I think a lot of that efforts are being made co-jointly with the Ministry of Law and a couple of NGOs. There's also something on gig economy and etc., which I think has been kind of expected that you see NGOs taking forward on this. Um, but then I think I would like to be critical on issues, for instance, like security and etc., where we have it's much more, I think, unique because we don't really think about security in an angle where it's just purely like, for instance, guns or etc. I think there's also issues about food security and etc. That has not been really engaged very aggressively by NGOs, or even if they do, the reception on the government's end is not really that favorable, for instance. Um, but on the other hand, I think when we're looking at this, on the influential part, while you can see the manifestation in getting resolutions or declaration, it also, we can see now there is a plethora of entry points. Because back then, I think when we look, I don't know, about 2 to 3 decades ago, the only typical route is that first is either this NGO start to do campaigning and then they get a courtesy call with like a minister, they talk about it and try to work their way in. But now there are also like a strengthened institution through Parliament where we have this mechanism called the All-Party Parliamentarian Group. So there's a couple of thematics. For instance, we have SDG. We have, I think one is on like racial harmony and etc. So that means the discussion actually allows NGO to kind of speak up more. Um, and in ASEAN level, one thing that I think during this ASEAN chairmanship we're able to kind of navigate very well is that we truly utilize, or in this case, the government is trying to utilize our ICHAR representative. So it's the ASEAN Intercommission, or yeah, Commission of Human Rights, Intergovernmental, something like that. So um recently they launched this declaration on healthy environment, something like that. And if I'm not mistaken, there's like about 15 NGOs that are local, and even other regional colleagues are actually being involved from the consultation to the drafting process, and now even conversation are kickstarting on how do we want to implement this declaration in the region. So I think it has been good, but my final remark on this is just going back on the struggles. As first, often than not, it tends to be in this like limited scope, but it's also often being championed by these NGOs or entities that are rather established. So that means it's first, in a way, while it is good that it's established and well resourced, but newer voices are kind of being sidelined because there is internal competition between the NGO or like the civil space. Collaboration is rather a question mark, and it can be murky in a couple of thematic areas. But second of all, I think in Malaysia, we have this, I don't want to put it as a crisis or a dilemma, but it's definitely what we are going through, is in the question of how organic is that issue being really raised. Because there are certain issues, for instance, the recently launched National Action Plan that is collaborated by UNDP and a couple of NGO colleagues on business and human rights. We can definitely see it's championed very well, but it has been very selective to only a part of the dimension. But there are, like, for instance, like the bullying, it is much more organic because even without the civil society, the whole entire Malaysian as a nation is on board on the issue. So I think it's moving forward. I guess for the grassroots movement, it's about realigning the priorities and trying to work together collectively. But I think having that end goal is something rather ideal to work with, but it's a matter of trying to prioritize what is the agenda at hand and how can we work together with, let's say, entities like government and etc., trying to kind of make sure that all of this influence can be manifested to the end product. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we lost Fazril here. I want to move to the second agenda about the national development or the state of national development of Malaysia. But I want to start with this a basic, not basic, but a very um, amateur questions, if I may, right, to put it that way. Reflecting from Indonesian story, I want to ask to you from Malaysian point of view and Malaysian story, right? Um, in Indonesia, we just social political development. The major social political development was in 1998. We got a become a full-fledged democracy, and since then we have a general elections every 5 years. So the president is elected directly by the people. The dynamic of that, the dynamic consequence because of that reform is that the national development always changing the narratives every 5 years or even every government, right? Even there are some jokes in Indonesia, new government, new history, right? It's not a new narrative, new history. And Malaysia has been quite very consistent with their development plan since when until the elections when I think it was before COVID, right? Not mistaken, right? And UMNO, and then they for the first time they lose in elections, and then new government, and the government change, the administration keep changing in Malaysia, and I become as Indonesian, how Malaysian society there or not coping with that situation. But I believe Malaysia has a very strong, resilient Malaysian, civil society, secure resilience. But in terms of economy, in terms of development, right? Uh, how that been navigates. Every government has a different focus or has a different priority or even has a different jargons. What I know now, Prime Minister Anwar with Madani Malaysia, right? How this continue in Indonesia? We used to have GBHN, is Gambaran Haluan Besar Pembangunan Negara. It's just a change into RPJMN. Is a short and long-term national development. Whoever the administration is should be follow the national long or short-term national development. It become a law already, right? Do you have that kind of thing in Malaysia? So whoever the administration is, that should be follow the general rule or general game plan. So please enlighten us. As your neighbor, we are a bit, try to get understand about the Malaysia's economic development and also social economy. One good insight that I got it when I just returned from Malaysia a few months ago is that we are have a ambition to be a Malaysia's Southeast Asia's Taiwan, good on chip semiconductors. We want to be champion that in Southeast Asia. So give me more insights about Malaysia's social, political, economic development way ahead, and how the dynamic politically affect the national development. I think I go to you, Thomas, and then I go to Elisa after this. Thomas.
Sure, Calvin. Uh, Again, not really my field, and it's such a broad question, but I'll try anyway. I think in Malaysia, generally, when new governments come, and new governments is a relatively new term to us compared to you guys in Indonesia. we only had our first change of government through elections in 2018. Previously, it was various iterations of the same ruling coalition since independence. And I think a lot of people anticipated some kind of change, but then political realities, lethargy, dealing with the civil service, etc., all that meant that change did not come as quickly as possible. And I think what we're seeing is that subsequent governments have always come to realize that they need to be careful about what they promise in terms of election manifestos, etc., especially if voters learn how to punish governments and or elections, electoral coalitions. And we're not seeing that yet, but let's see what the next round of elections will bring. The other thing to remember is that coalition politics, in the way that it's practiced almost everywhere else, excuse me, it's also new to Malaysia. Our coalitions tended to be dominated by one large party or the other, whether in government or opposition. That's now changed, right? So now you have actual coalitional politics, and coalitional politics is very messy. We've seen that even in countries in Europe where coalitional politics has been a norm for decades. We've seen that in Indonesia as well. Excuse me. So coalitional politics is something that I think Malaysian political parties, but also Malaysian voters will have to learn how to deal with and anticipate. In terms of governance, I would think that every new government, every new political leadership will want their own stamp of governance, of ruling forward. This is very much a signature of Malaysian governance since time immemorial. That said, there is very little space to deviate from the median line, whether it's in domestic politics or in foreign policy. So I don't see too much of deviation. Any deviation really will normally be externally driven rather than internally made. Again, it's a super huge question. So I'll stop here and maybe Alyssa can speak more. Then maybe if something else comes in my head, I can jump in.
Right. Oh, no, I think Thomas kind of I would say the context very nicely. I would say, I very much agree on the point that, if Thomas used the word stamp, I would put slogan instead, because I think that branding is very vital for a lot of the administration. Perhaps it's more for like a political appeal. But I think if you look more on the policies itself, like Thomas mentioned, there's not much deviation from each elements. So allow me to quote like this name of the policy. We call it Rancangan Malaysia ke XX. So it depends on what number you have. So it's technically the Malaysia plan. Right now we are in the 13th iteration that is being tabled in the parliament. So if you were to study from the first Malaysia plan all the way, which I have to disclaim myself, like I'm not an expert on this public policy field, but from my prior understanding is that the idea has been more focused on economic base and development. How do we want to move together as a nation? I think, Calvin, you mentioned earlier something like a very similar policy that you have in Indonesia, that it tends to be rather the same, but probably have different features. So I think looking at the current Malaysia plan, we can definitely see there are a little excerpts that are much different compared to the previous one. So one biggest highlight was tabled in Parliament was the mentioning about we now want to go and innovate and push a bit more of our investment, energy, and etc. into this industries called like high growth, high value. So that's why we mentioned something about semiconductor, data centers, let's say energy, and etc. So I think in terms of like how much of a difference when it comes to national development, it also comes a lot in political will, and that is corresponding with potential backlashes. Why I say so is that one of the efforts that was trying to be tabled now is a lot on nuclear energy, for instance, which I'm like on the side trying to kind of take a look more. So I think the two previous administration, they were trying to bring up this nuclear technology where we want to have like, let's say, nuclear energy supplying to our grids. But there was like a scandal where like one of the reactors kind of have an incident, and that create huge trauma for the country that up to this day, a lot of people are still having negative thoughts about nuclear energy, for instance. But I think one thing that they're trying to step up is maybe trying to be more practical. And I think in this sense, first is trying to be practical to feed into like the national demand for energy, but also second to leverage that as a bargaining chip. Let's say trying to build more and foster relations. For instance, like we see that Malaysia is now heading to, let's say, South Korea, Japan, and even have conversation with a lot of European counterparts, let's say Russia, to kind of develop their nuclear technology as well. So I think right now, the story when it comes to the development side, rather than aside from the national unity part, I think we are, maybe I'm a bit ambitious saying this, but I think we are exploring a bit in a sense where let's not stick in the typical backyard of just, okay, we take one foot at a time. I think the geopolitical pressure is now coming up to us to the point that maybe we need to step up and think outside of the box. We need to take up like that ambition of like perhaps covering new assets. Like for instance, if we were to talk about 5 years ago or 5 to 10 years ago about semiconductors or even having a lot of these type of technological fields, I think we, at least Malaysian in general, we're not ready up to that stage. But now, even if you just talk about AI, I feel like generally it's already a norm here. So I think those are my two thoughts. If Thomas, you want to chime in and have any extra points on that, feel free to go ahead.
No, nothing to add in particular.
Okay. Thank you so much. By the way, I'm welcome to anyone who wants to ask a questions. You can put it here in the Zoom, or you can put it in the chat box in YouTube, right? Any questions to this? Um, my last questions to you, right, is about people-centered ASEAN. I'll shift a little bit to ASEAN again, right? Because I think Fazil is lost, right? So I think he's out, drops. But now we'll shift a little bit to foreign policy. FVCI and PSAT have been working hardly on the ASEAN for the People's Conference on 6 to 7 September. And 10 years ago, Malaysia um, founded the ASEAN People Forum, right? So Malaysia is, for me, I think, Alyssa, you're right. Civic space in Malaysia have been very rampant, very loud, right? If I would say, and that inspires ASEAN also to do more. In my very simple questions, if in ASEAN Declaration in KL 2015, there's a term people-centered, people-oriented, right? Even in the in the charters, we started with we the people, right? But we know that ASEAN is very elitist, leaders-led, right? So in ASEAN context, Thomas, right? We know ASEAN with different political cultures, different political system. What is people-centered really for you, right? In ASEAN contracts, and for you also, Elisa, what does that mean? Should we have more mechanism? Does that mechanism should be institutionalized or what? And I just want to know about that. And by the way, I just received a questions from Mahdi Muhammad, right? I think Mahdi is from Kompas, what I know, right? I think um, so the question is, let me read out to you, right? In the context of this, Thomas, and also to you, Alyssa. In the context of Cambodia-Thailand borders, two major powers are attempting to exert influence resolving the conflicts, the US and China. There have been changes on the ground, but tensions remain because the border issues between the two countries remains unresolved. China has again offered assistance to both countries to resolve the conflicts. However, we know that China also plays a role in improving defense security in both countries. The question is, how does Malaysia, as a chair of ASEAN, view China's desire to mediate this issue, especially in the context of ASEAN centrality? we know that ASEAN actually wants to resolve various issues, member, through this, right? And what can ASEAN do to resolve? Second is about Ambalat. Wow, it's another hot tea, right? We know that this issue has been dormant in ICJ, and what I want to know is what issues are in Malaysia that have caused the Ambalat issues resurface. So it's important concrete issues to these two questions. I give it back to Thomas and Alice. I think you just to answer this first, Cambodia and Thailand, and also about the Ambalat, and then after that about the people centered. You can post it up your statement with that. I know Thomas, you need to leave after this. Thomas, please go.
Sure. On the Thailand Cambodia issue and China's desire to mediate, I mean, that's no surprise. China wants to mediate. Obviously, China will want to mediate. It certainly changed its position after the United States managed to, after the role of the United States and this administration in sort of forcing through some sort of back down on the Thai position. So you can certainly imagine that Beijing wants to play catch up and sort of come back in, and they are a legitimate player, good relationships with both sides, etc., that they can use to leverage. So if they want to play a constructive role, that's great. What can ASEAN do to resolve this? I don't know what much ASEAN can do, to be honest. I think there's a lot of rhetoric there about what ASEAN can do. But if you look at Bangkok's position, they don't want ASEAN involved at all. They agreed to Malaysia as chair of ASEAN, but not to get the whole of ASEAN involved. ASEAN centrality, well, we like to talk about ASEAN centrality, and now you see the limits of it. That's very much normal to me. I think, I've heard arguments of, you've got major powers coming in to bring about, to sort of push this to a dispute. And maybe that just shows the real limitations of what we have in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. But then it also shows that perhaps, ASEAN also has a role where ASEAN might not be able to force through some kind of de-escalation of peace. You depend on your external dialogue partners to do that for you, but then you come in to support the mediation process where necessary. And I think it's a very, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a very pragmatic thing moving forward. On Ambalat, I must confess, even though I look at Malaysian foreign policy, I haven't really followed that issue. I do have to apologize for that. However, on the question, what are the issues in Malaysia and what has caused the Ambalat issue to resurface? I think it was, what caused it to resurface was the meeting between Prime Minister Anwar and President Prabowo, where they were proposing for joint development in the Sulawesi Sea. That naturally led to, I think, stakeholders from Malaysia and Indonesia at the provincial state level bringing up the question of Ambalat, etc. Whether there were discussions, whether either party is ceding sovereignty. Wisma Putra would reply with a very traditional standard reply of not recognizing the term Ambalat. They use the blocks N7, etc. But I think it's interesting that with sort of it's sometimes with leaders like Prime Minister Anwar and President Prabowo, where perhaps leaders like this, very unconventional people in many ways, which is where you can perhaps find some breakthroughs in terms of long-standing problems. Malaysia is certainly no stranger to joint development in areas where there's contested sovereignty. Just look at the Gulf of Thailand, where Malaysia and Thailand neither side have dropped claims to the parts of the Gulf of Thailand which are disputed, but both sides are almost at the tail end of a 40-year cooperation, 40-year joint resource agreement to exploit oil and gas in the Gulf of Thailand. So it's extremely doable if politicians on both sides and leaders on both sides and government on both sides agree to go ahead.
Amen. Thank you, Thomas. Elisa.
Yeah, so I think these questions are also quite tricky because first and foremost, I think I would say my expertise are just only on like an observer level, like just casually reading and being in the space. But I think firstly on the issue of like the Thailand Cambodia dispute, I think perhaps like what I will echo what Thomas has mentioned on China. I would not add much on that. But I think it also presents us to another opportunity. I will say this with caution because take it with a grain of salt. Because this also plays into more of like geopolitical pressure and etc. But I think perhaps it will open up some window, for instance, to have a much more deeper discussion.
Yes.
For instance, you can see that while we have like this mediation happening on like a
Dia kata
government level, we can definitely do it much more on other tracks, for instance, because what we are understanding a lot of this dispute is coming from more of like the political end, but I would say on the ground, it looks a bit different. So I don't know, maybe I would like to classify the motivations might be entirely different in of itself. Some may say that it is intertwined, but it's different. So I think perhaps there's I truly believe in I'll say this, I subscribe to this, where there's a lot of, I think, healing required, like the trauma healing from both countries when it comes to these border issues also have to be done. So perhaps this could be actually a very good opportunities for both countries, even like in the universities level or NGO level, to kind of find rooms to just perhaps understand and create forum and discussion to kind of make sure that we can find areas or points where we can be together. And I think Malaysia at that point perhaps could leverage this situation and provide this as a point to have actually the ASEAN way, because why just leave it to the both of the countries to kind of work things out? Well, a lot of the other countries are not really familiar, oh, what are the stories happening on the ground and etc. So I think it could be rather interesting to not only hear from the peace builders on the ground, but also to navigate that space. On the issue of Ambalat, not much to say because I think Thomas kind of wrap it up very beautifully. But just one thing to add on about how the leaders on that side, I think a lot of the conversation has been more of a backlash within the parliament itself. Because I think the only news that they actually, like the local leaders are getting it, is only from like the news sources. So I think one angle that I think it's not only an issue within Wisma Putra or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or etc., but I think coordination moving forward is how do you deal within federal and state relations? Because this is matter of like a country and another country, but it's on a disputed area which concerns of a state that also have somewhat an autonomous overview of it. So I think that lens is pretty much important. And very briefly on your question, Calvin, about the people-centered mechanism, I think Malaysia has been trying their best to champion having more inclusivity, and even in the CS chairmanship priorities, like their slogan is like sustainability and inclusivity. I think one thing moving forward is that I don't want to say this out of like criticism, but it depends to a certain extent, because for me, I think there are efforts being very people-centered, but the conversation always tend to be, okay, until to the peak of ASEAN summits. Let's say we go to December moving forward. What happened to the conversation then? Then what about the manifestation of, let's say, all the practicalities that we put inside these beautiful declarations? So I don't think we had to reinvent the wheel by having more mechanism. I don't believe in that. I think it's just better to give more awareness and strengthen these mechanisms. For instance, like a lot of the scholarships, a lot of actually not only Malaysians, but a lot of ASEAN nationals doesn't know that we have all these opportunities. And I think I don't want to put the fault that because the headquarters in Jakarta or anything, but I think a lot of this information is only centered for those who are really deeply into the topic of ASEAN, and they might be in that bubble. But often than not many people are. They are just general practitioners, or they're just looking at IR or Southeast Asia and not even ASEAN as an entity in that sense. So I think if we truly want to go and embark in that journey of truly having a people-centered conversation, we need to actually, I would say, not symbolize, but actually implement the idea of merakyatkan, or having that democratization of ASEAN, even in the local context, where it is becoming a norm and we actually embody it. So I'll stop there and happy to answer further questions as well.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thomas also should leave, and we just received many questions, and I believe there are questions that have been answered about the people and people-centered mechanism, and also about the Malaysia's foreign policy. Um, Let me check this liberty to little bit wrapping up and also not only thanking Thomas and also Elisa to have enlightened us with a lot of insights about Malaysia, but we can learn that Malaysia's foreign policy is more or less have the same agency with Indonesian foreign policy. That's what I can learn as Indonesian. And we also can understand how Malaysia, that sits right in the middle, right? Sorry, that sits right in the middle, has been exposed with the international community and have um, come into a common understanding of values of multicultural, multi-religions, multi um, uh, differences, which can be melted in a pot and even drafted into a new, um, uh, become a force to move forward together. And that create Malaysia today. And that shows how Malaysia has a DNA being pragmatic. It navigates the big powers and put a note, everybody. Southeast Asia has been, what I call bergulat, right? If have been involved, in with the elements since colonials, even before, and we are striving and survive and always know how to navigate these differences. And uh, I personally believe that ASEAN has been successful turning the region of Southeast Asia from uh, regions of conflict to the regions of peace and stability. And Malaysia is a key country in pushing that forward. And Malaysia is even the first, Malaysia always coming out to the table with a very innovative and critical proposals like having China in a mechanism in East Asia, or even to have uh, make China as a dialogue partners in 1990s is Malaysia proposals. And in 2015, Malaysia also even initiated the ASEAN People Forum, right? And so you always come in a provoking initiative, which very contributive to the ASEAN development. And ASEAN is very vital for your foreign policy also. Um, Now I think it's time for the people to be more have agency and needs more mechanism in ASEAN to provide for the people. By the way, Thomas and Alisa, I coined this term of if country has geopolitics, I think people has geocivic, right? It's a by geography we are bound together, right? Civic means we have a agency to work together with good deeds, right? With a respect of dignity, like what Bang Fazril has said. So that's a another story for ASEAN way ahead, and I believe it's also another story for civic to civic cooperations. And I'm happy to learn another important notes from this conversation I took when the civic space globally is shrinking, but actually in Malaysia is thriving. So that's a good note that I took. That civic space still has a lot of rooms to grow in Malaysia, and I hope also in Southeast Asia. And civic space there is to support and become a partner of the government to advance the stability and prosperity in the region. Um, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. And again, thank you to you, Thomas, my friend, Elisa, for joining us to this afternoon conversation. Sorry for borrowing your beautiful Friday to talk this very philosophical, very quite heavy discussion. But thank you for giving your time to PSAT, talking to us. Thank you so much. And to all friends in the region, please subscribe to PSAT, right? And also follow our Instagram at PSAT, right? And we are new, by the way, so still very small followers. So I invite you to follow PSAT, more discussion. This is the first episode of Malaysia. The next would be the next ASEAN countries. We're still looking which countries, but definitely ASEAN the countries will be discussed. We will discuss one by one about their foreign policy and their a development way ahead. Thank you so much. Salam hangat from Jakarta and happy weekend and peace. Salam diplomasi. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.